If you want your videos to look professional, you've got to nail your exposure because nothing looks more amateur than blown out white skies or an underexposed subject. Now, luckily, most cameras or monitors have tools built into them to help you get a proper exposure. And I'm gonna break down the most useful tools right now. But before we can talk about any of the tools, you have to understand something called IRE. Now wait, before you click off, this is useful info and I'm gonna make it really easy to understand. IRE is an analog video signal unit of measurement for LUMA, established by the Institute of Radio Engineers. Okay, I lied, that did sound complicated, but realistically, when filming in the most common and standard color space of Rec. 709, the luminance values that can be effectively captured range from 0 to 100 IRE. It's really that simple. Now, your image must stay within that range or data will be lost. If the light hitting your sensor is above 100 IRE, it'll blow out your highlights and all detail will be lost in that area of the image. This is most commonly seen in videos where bright skies are in the background. Likewise, if anything in your frame falls below 0 IRE, there won't be any detail or information captured. It'll be completely black. So the goal is to get a well-balanced exposure and image with the most amount of information all within those IRE parameters of 0 to 100. Unless you're filming HDR, then everything completely changes and you're actually keeping your exposure within 0 to 1000 IRE, but for the sake of this video, we're just gonna keep it simple and focus on SDR. The dynamic range your camera is capable of capturing will of course help you capture the most information from dark to bright. For example, a GoPro Hero 9 only has 9 stops of dynamic range, meaning it'll blow out a lot easier as opposed to something like the Sony a7S III that has 15 stops of dynamic range and can handle shadows and bright highlights together a lot better. But no matter what camera you have, as long as you know how to expose it properly, you can make a nice looking image. All right, now that you understand IRE and dynamic range a little bit better, let's talk about the first useful tool for getting proper exposure, the waveform. More specifically, the LUMA waveform. You won't find this tool on many DSLR or mirrorless cameras, but it is on most video monitors from companies like SmallHD, Atomos, and many others. The waveform is a graph from 0 to 100 along the y-axis, and it's typically divided up into quarters going from 0 to 25, 50, 75, and then 100. The waveform will show your entire image but in a graphed out form. So if you're filming a person, you'll likely see kind of like a large mountain in the middle representing them and their skin tones. And if they're wearing a bright white shirt, it could show large peaks nearing 100 around them, and that's representing like their shoulders and chest. Whereas if they're wearing a dark black shirt, it could show very low down towards maybe even 0. And if you move your hand around, you'll see the graph change and adjust. It just takes a minute to visualize your image in graph form, but once you see it, you'll easily be able to recognize what parts of the image the graph is representing. Now, if you want to see exactly what your exposure is doing, all overlaid over the exact image, you should use false color. False color is my other go-to tool for nailing exposure. False color is on cameras like the Blackmagic Pocket Cinema cameras, but not on many other smaller mirrorless cameras and non-cinema cameras. So again, you'll need to use your external monitor for this feature. False colors also show you the exposure of your image from 0 to 100 IRE, but it's color-coded typically in increments of 10. Not every false color tool follows the same color coding, so you'll need to look at the key to see what IRE value each color represents. Typically, blue represents dark or shadow areas, yellow, orange, and red represent areas that are bright or overexposing, then different shades of gray represent pretty much everything in between, and you also have purple, pink, and green thrown into the mix. Again, just refer to your key for the exact values. False color is the quickest way to identify problem areas in your image. You can quickly identify any overexposed sky because it'll be blaring bright red, or you can see skin tones that are too hot because they may be yellow or orange. I use this all the time to make sure my subjects don't have any hot spots on their skin. For example, a shiny forehead that's overexposing will present as a giant red spot on their head. And if I see something like that, I'll adjust my lighting or add more diffusion or adjust my camera settings as needed until the hot spot no longer shows up on false color. The next tool we're going to look at are zebras. Zebras are on many common DSLR and mirrorless cameras. Typically, you can set up in your camera when zebras will appear. The settings to use can be a little bit confusing at first, but essentially if you set your zebras to 70, they will start to show up in your image when anything is at 70 IRE or above. So if you see zebras, that doesn't mean everything is at exactly 70 IRE, it just means it's at or above 70. So if you're trying to expose your skin tones as 70 IRE, a nice way to do this is dial up your brightness just until you see the zebras appear on your subject's skin. Then you can dial back your exposure a little until they disappear again, and you'll know you're in the right spot. If you set your zebras to 100, they won't show up on your LCD until parts of your image reach 100 IRE. And at that point, that area is blown out completely white. And if you have a subject in the scene, they're likely overexposed as well. So setting your zebras to 100 IRE is a good way to quickly identify anything that is totally blown out and dial your exposure back. But it won't be much help for getting skin tone exposure. So I recommend setting your zebras to appear around 70 IRE just for that. One of the most common tools for getting exposure is the histogram, and you're likely already familiar with it, especially if you've done photography in the past. The histogram is a graph representing brightness values from left to right, with the darkest point being 0 on the left and the brightest point being 100 on the right. Typically, a good exposure will have a nice mountain or hill in the middle of the graph. This means you have nice midtones and you're not clipping in the whites or blacks. However, depending on what you're filming, this is not always the case. If you're filming at night, the histogram will most likely be all the way spiked up on the left-hand side. And if you're filming something against a bright white background or maybe on a beach, you could have huge peaks on the right side, saying you're overexposed. But that's okay. Your camera doesn't know what the scene is and how it should be exposed exactly. So that's why following the histogram isn't my favorite way to judge exposure for video, because it's really not that insightful, honestly. Something else you can do is use a gray card. A gray card will help you reach middle gray or 18% gray with your camera. You can hold the gray card in your scene and use spot metering on your camera to read it and adjust your settings until the arrow on your meter is dead center on 0. I don't typically like to use this method, and it's more commonly used by photographers, but it is a tool you can use. Another tool you can use is a light meter. There are two main types of light meters, incident and reflective. Incident light meters will read the light that falls directly onto your subject. So typically you hold the light meter underneath your subject's chin, and then you can adjust your camera exposure or lighting accordingly. An incident light meter is probably one of the most accurate ways to get the right exposure on a subject, since it reads the exact amount of light falling onto them. Reflective light meters are what your camera has built into them. It's measuring the light bouncing off of your subject and then back into your camera lens. Now, I've used light meters on set many times, and they're super useful, especially when you have ones that can also get color temperature readings, so you can set the perfect white balance. But I still need to buy one of my own instead of just borrowing everyone else's on set. So these are the most common ways to measure and nail your exposure on set when filming. And once you've spent enough time using these different tools, you'll likely end up using a mixture of them on every shoot, and it will become second nature. Now guys, if you want to see more videos like this, hit subscribe right now, because I have a ton more videos coming on shooting, editing, lighting, gear reviews, everything like that, and you don't want to miss them. All right, I'll see you in the next video.